Hello and welcome to the 7th video update for the What If interactive wargame campaign that we're running here at the Battle of Prestonpans Museum in East Lothian, Scotland. I'm Arran and it's my job to guide you through this campaign fought in real time, imagining what might have happened in 1745 if you had been able to make the decisions. So it's been the Facebook followers of the Battle of Prestonpans Heritage Trust who've been determining the big strategic decisions. Now, hopefully most of you have seen the previous videos that have brought us up to this point, with Prince Charlie and his main Jacobite army laying siege to the great city of Newcastle in the north of England, and the Duke of Cumberland leading the last remaining British full-field army close up to its relief. Now, it's a bit of a nail-biter here. The siege is ongoing, but Cumberland is making progress despite the bad weather, close up towards the Jacobites. As we reported in the last update, the Jacobites had completed entrenching opposite the west gate of the city and were bombarding the walls. However, they'd also determined that they were going to take an aggressive approach to this phase of the siege, launching operations to try and bring their mortars as close to the walls as possible. As a result, the Jacobites had delayed the full bombardment that might breach the walls in order to bring their mortar batteries close to the walls to dismount the enemy's cannons, hoping to limit the number of casualties the army would have to take if it attempted to launch an assault on the city walls itself. These operations were successful, destroying all but one of the mounted guns on this side of the city defences. And in the days after the events covered by the last video, the Jacobite batteries continued to hammer at the walls, many of which had now been abandoned by their defenders because the mortar batteries were able to inflict damage. And in fact, Pulteney's regiment had pulled back, already suffering a number of casualties. And you might recall from the previous video that the way that we're playing out this siege is that in the small-scale actions, casualties carry over to the following game. The Jacobites did eventually manage to put a breach into the walls of the city, which means there's an access straight into the streets, and in fact, over the next few days, a second breach was opened too. The question then became whether the Jacobites had the time to continue the siege, or whether they needed to risk an assault. And of course, the context of this is that the Jacobite army at the siege of Newcastle is under considerable pressure from the approach of the Duke of Cumberland. Now, the Jacobite army is currently entrenched about here. This is a plan of the area around the city from a couple of decades after the battle, but not a great deal has changed in the greater scheme of things. Now, of course, the Cumberland's first option is to bring his relieving army into Newcastle from the south over the Tyne Bridge, and then either reinforce Wade and sit out the siege, or, more likely, to launch a sally en masse against the Jacobite army that way. The alternative, however, and this is what the British Council has actually decided to do, was to move the army out of Durham on a different road, which brought them up to Wickham, and then brought them round here to Ryton, from which they could cross Newburn Ford, allowing them to come round into the rear of the Jacobite position, forcing Charles Edward to fight a battle in this area with Wade on one side of his army and Cumberland on the other. This would be an overwhelming force, and the Jacobites would be in a really difficult position. However, the Jacobites have considered this option, and they decided that rather than attempt an assault on the city, they would leave a covering force at Newcastle, and they themselves would march round to Newburn and take up a defensive position across the fords there. Now, this was a battlefield from 1640 where a Scots army had won a considerable victory over a much smaller English army during the Bishops' Wars. And in that case, it was the Scots army that had to fight across the fords to get onto the English side. In this situation, it would be the Duke of Cumberland who would be looking to try and force his way over the defended fords against the Jacobites. So, this is the situation we have when, on the 16th of December, Marshal Wade looks across the walls of Newcastle and sees that the Jacobite siege lines have gone suspiciously quiet. In fact, the Jacobite decision-makers had been really torn over how to respond to this situation. Some of them were for escalating the walls to nip the situation at Newcastle in the bud as quickly as possible. Others were for marching straight on Cumberland. although the consensus in the end seemed to be that they should certainly move the bulk of the army towards Newburn Ford, either to cross to face Cumberland themselves or to wait for his approach there. The covering force that's been left was Lord John Drummond's division, and that includes the mortar batteries that had been advanced close towards the walls. So 2 batteries of mortars, one on either side of our gaming table. But the rest of the covering force is stretched rather thin if it's attempting to hold all of the Jacobite siege lines. In fact, they're generally clustered towards the northern side of the lines, at the extreme end of which is the Ogilvy Regiment, and alongside them are the Royal Écossaise, the professional French soldiers, very fine uniforms manning the siege lines. They're supported by the small unit of pickets from the Irish Brigade, also French soldiers, of course. And over on the far end of the line, Lord Lewis Gordon's regiment occupying the pleasure grounds of the former Fourth Tavern, now little more than a ruin. The pleasant tree-lined walks there turned into an abattis to protect their position. No Highland soldiers here. These are Lowland and French units, the ones which it was felt would be more comfortable with the occupation of the siege trenches, whilst the clansmen went out to the battle against Cumberland. So here's the bird's eye view of the Jacobite siege lines after the main army has left to go to Newburn. The mortar battery close to the walls at the top there. Behind them in the trenches, Ogilvy's regiment, then the Irish pickets and the Royal Écossaise, and then a considerably large open space of unoccupied trenches, and then at the far end, at the Fourth Tavern, there is Lord Lewis Gordon's, and overlooking the town ditch, the other mortar battery ahead. So this is the covering force which is pinning down Marshal Wade's garrison, which is about the same in terms of its numbers. We then gave the British Army decision makers the decision as to what to do now that the main Jacobite army had moved out of the siege lines. We didn't give them the full information as to how many Jacobite soldiers were left or what their dispositions were, except, of course, that they could still see the mortar batteries were in position. We gave them the option of either simply holding their position and taking no aggressive action, launching a limited sally to try and knock out the mortar batteries, or launching a full sally against the whole Jacobite siege lines. Perhaps confident now that Cumberland was approaching rapidly and believing that the Jacobites won't have been able to leave too strong a force down in the siege lines if they were hoping to fight a battle, Marshal Wade has decided to sally his army out in its entirety and attack the Jacobite siege lines. So the stage is set for the next phase of the siege of Newcastle. Marshal Wade massing his garrison behind the gates and the breaches, ready for a sudden sally. It's a bit of an all-or-nothing approach from the Redcoats here, but we have given them a get-out clause. If things go sour and they can get men not only back into the city, but then back to the far table edge, then we'll treat those men as having successfully withdrawn away from the outer defences towards the castle in the centre of the city, from which they could continue to hold out, even if the Jacobites took the outer areas of the town. So there is a possibility that even in the case of a defeat on the siege lines, Marshal Wade's forces could fall back to the inner lines. As with all of our siege engagements, this is limited to an 8-turn battle. At the left of his line, Marshal Wade's militia, the Northumberland militia, have massed behind the 4th Port, ready to rush out towards the mortar battery opposite them, whilst the rest are massed at the West Gate itself and at the 2 breaches either side. And the first order rolls for Marshal Wade are very successful. Cholmondeley's regiment come through the West Gate itself and out down the centre of the line. The Royal Scots, at the top of the image there, they manage to get out of the breach and form into line opposite the mortar batteries. As they do, they come under fire and are put into disorder, so their advance is stopped. At the other end of the line, Pulteney's regiment leads the attack, but Pulteney's has already endured casualties from the earlier operations from mortar fire, and so is going into the engagement already with casualties on its plate. Behind them come the Composite Battalion, the survivors of the regiments broken at the Third Battle of Dunbar. It's perhaps a reflection of the confusion on both sides during such a scrappy engagement and an unexpected fight that both sides have some pretty poor order rolls during the course of the engagement. The Jacobites have a bad start in responding, although they managed to get the Ogilvy regiment there at the bottom forward of the siege lines. The Irish pickets, just a small unit, come right forwards on their own to line that wall there to try and protect the mortar battery. The Jacobites had intended to try and pull that mortar battery back so that they could defend the siege lines themselves, but they were disordered, and so the mortars were static, and that meant they needed to be defended up there against the town ditch. The Royal Écosse, however, did nothing and stayed in the trenches themselves. So the Irish pickets look suddenly very small and very vulnerable, although they're sheltering behind the wall of some of those suburbs that were cleared before the main siege began. In the other sector, where Pulteney's are rushing forwards, they come forwards, but they fail their order to move into line and to advance any further, and this leaves them stuck out there in column, right under the muzzles of the Jacobite mortars. Those mortars open fire, and of course the effect of the mortar fire on Pulteney's regiment is devastating. Since they'd suffered casualties already, it's not long before they are forced to break test. They fail the test, and Pulteney's regiment, very early in the engagement, are broken completely. The Composite Battalion of the survivors from the Third Battle of Dunbar, they have no such woes, however. They rush through the wreckage of Pulteney's regiment and they surge forward. They actually are ordered to charge the mortar battery. They fail to do it, however, and they only succeed in getting very close to them. Fortunately, within the arc of their minimum fire range, so safe from the mortars themselves and ready on the next turn to inflict some serious damage onto that crew there, which already has casualties. Slow to get off the mark, the Northumberland militia do eventually sally forwards from their port, and given some confidence perhaps by the fact that the mortars are now under pressure, they move forwards. The mortars concentrating their fire on Pulteney's mean that the militia have a safe run out of the city gate. Lord Lewis Gordon's regiment, they're in the 4th Tavern. They can see the problem developing for that mortar battery, but they are kept within their defensive position at the 4th, which is simply too strong to abandon. Instead, the mortar battery is ordered to withdraw, and they, for once, have a successful order roll and do move position back to the shelter of the 4th. So the Jacobites have managed to pull the battery out of harm's way, and they are now forced to exchange pretty ineffective volleys. The large regiment of Lord Lewis Gordon's men, they're in a very solid defensive position, exchanging fire with the Composite Battalion, which is now able to take advantage of the shelter of the gabions which had once protected the Jacobite mortars. So not much happening over here, and it's clear that the battle will not be determined by this desultory firefight. Rather, all eyes turn to the other end of the battlefield, where the Irish pickets have reached the wall and are trying to put some fire into the flank of the Royal Scots, as they are stalled by their disorder within range of the mortars. And the Irish pickets look extremely vulnerable at this point, their support from the siege lines coming far too slowly. Their disordered clear, the Royal Scots managed to swing around to charge the wall and the Irish pickets there rather than engaging in a firefight, hoping to clear them off quickly. That at least prevents the mortars being able to continue their shelling there. But the pickets managed to put in a good volley of closing fire, which further disorders the Royal Scots and prevents them from being able to score an early success by breaking the pickets. As you can see, though, Marshal Wade is successful in moving Cholmondeley's regiment round onto the flank of the pickets, and the situation here is looking very dangerous for the Jacobites indeed. So far, Jacobite order rolls have been pretty poor, but Drummond desperately needs to get Ogilvy's men up in support of the Irish pickets to prevent Cholmondeley's coming round on the flank and sweeping them off the field. The Royal Écossois, still at the siege lines, are being urged forwards, and eventually they finally get themselves moving. Cholmondeley's flanking move is checked by the charge of Ogilvy's. They take a few casualties during the closing fire, but they successfully smash into the line and pin them there, saving the Irish pickets from almost certain destruction. And as the fight rolls into the next turn, the Irish pickets continue their fight with the Royal Scots. Ogilvy's continue their fight with Cholmondeley's regiment, and the Royal Écossois eventually come up in order to support the latter. Since it's clear the engagement over by the 4th Tavern isn't going to decide the outcome here, Marshal Wade decides that he'll leave the Composite Battalion to pin down Lord Lewis Gordon's men there, whilst redirecting the Northumberland militia, who never got out of column yet, along the town ditch towards the action where they might be able to put some support in behind Cholmondeley's. And of course, during all of this, the one surviving garrison gun mounted on the west gate continues to fire on the Jacobite positions, particularly targeting at this point the Royal Écossois. Eventually, the Irish pickets are driven back from the wall by the Royal Scots, but they are successful in their break test insofar as all they are required to do is fall back in disorder. This means that Ogilvy's are now in serious trouble, but at least they have a double layer of support behind them. It also means that the Royal Scots are now unengaged and sitting right in front of the Jacobite mortar batteries. They've taken casualties already. They took casualties during the fight with the Irish pickets, and now they are blasted by mortar shells, and they are unable to take any more. The Royal Scots Regiment breaks. At this point, Marshal Wade is sensing the tide is turning against him, and the best he can hope for is to get what remains of his force back into the city, hopefully through the streets and off towards the castle. Still in column, the Northumberland militia, having marched out of one gate around the back of their friends, are now marching back into the city through one of the breaches. And going in the opposite direction, the Composite Battalion successfully disengages from Lord Lewis Gordon's firefight, gets through the 4th port and slams the gates behind them. At this point now, at least 2 small units of the garrison have got back safely in the city, in column, and they now just have to race towards the back of the table edge. And more bad news for Marshal Wade. His heavily engaged unit, Cholmondeley's regiment, is cut up by Ogilvy's, supported by the Écosse, and broken. But there is some satisfaction for him too. The Irish pickets, having endured quite a lot during this battle, now come under fire from the remaining garrison cannon up on the west gate. They are shaken by that cannon, then they are disordered by that cannon, and eventually, unable to take it anymore, the Irish pickets break and flee the field. Knowing that they need to get that gun out of action before any further damage is done to the remaining Jacobite units, the Royal Écosse storm the west gate, and they successfully get themselves up the steps and onto the towers. Having silenced the remaining garrison gun, the Royal Écosse take up a position defending the west gate of Newcastle. The Jacobites have now secured the principal entry into the city. At this point, it's safe enough for Ogilvy's men to rush one breach, whilst Lord Lewis Gordon's men rush forwards from the 4th Tavern and enter the 2nd. It takes some time for the Jacobite forces to organise themselves into a formation that's able to get through the narrow spaces of the walls and gates, but nevertheless the race is now on to try and prevent the last remaining government forces from getting towards the castle and therefore extending the siege even by a few days. There's therefore considerable urgency as Ogilvy's and Gordon's rush into the city streets. And at this critical point, Marshal Wade's luck fails him again, and he has some poor order rolls which leave his columns struggling through the streets, making very little progress, even being able to use initiative orders. And as you can see, the Jacobites are gaining a lead on them as they advance down parallel streets. It's a nail-biting finish down to the final turn of the game. The Jacobites just about within reach of the column as it tries to sneak into the grounds of St John's Church. But within a hair's breadth of safety, the Northumberland militia find themselves successfully charged by Ogilvy's regiment, who smash into the rear of their column. They simply can't stand whilst in that exposed formation on the streets and are broken. At this point, all that remains of Marshal Wade's force is the single composite battalion, the survivors of the regiments broken at the Third Battle of Dunbar. They're forced in column, the men behind them have routed, and at this point it's determined the only sensible thing at the end of the final turn is for them to surrender to the Jacobites. And with that, the city of Newcastle has fallen. Marshal Wade's decision to launch an all-out sally against the Jacobite covering force without knowing its strength and without having previously destroyed those mortar batteries has cost him the city. Now, under any other normal circumstances, the fall of Newcastle would be headline news. But of course, it's in danger of being overshadowed by the events down at Newburn Ford, where the main Jacobite army is now facing off the Duke of Cumberland's force on the other side of the river. But neither side is going to attempt to try and force its way over the tidal fords at Newburn. The Jacobites don't feel they have to, and especially when they hear that the city has fallen, they will have control of the Tyne crossing at the city itself. So if Charles Edward wants to get across the river, he doesn't have to do it under fire at Newburn. Cumberland has already made the decision that he's not going to do it either. The decision there was that it was simply too great a risk. Instead, they're going to go upstream and try and find an alternative crossing point. Now, most of those alternatives are simply ferry points. To get to a stone bridge, he has to go as far as Corbridge, a full day's march away. Now, the Jacobites have a number of options. They can either cross Newburn in the wake of Cumberland and chase him along that road, or they can shadow parallel with him across the north side of the river and either stop him before he can cross the river at Corbridge, or allow him across and find a place to engage him before he can get to Newcastle. Alternatively, however, now that the Prince controls both the Newburn fords and the crossing at Newcastle itself, he could simply ignore Cumberland and take his army down into the heart of England. These are the decisions placing Prince Charlie. Now that the siege of Newcastle has come to its conclusion, the battle for the heart of England is about to begin. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for your comments, thanks for your likes. We hope to see you very soon with our next update as the campaign continues.